GDPR. There might be a bit of a misconception that GDPR is subject to a kind of regulation from a pan-EU body. In fact, GDPR gives the responsibility for regulation to what are called supervisory authorities in each member state. So it is down to each of the supervisory authorities in each member state to make sure that bodies or entities or undertakings which process data in those particular member states are complying with GDPR. Now, Jessica, you referred to the Information Commissioner's Office investigation of the Equifax breach. The Information Commissioner is the relevant supervisory authority in the United Kingdom. Where I am based, the relevant supervisory authority is called the Data Protection Commission, and it really has its work cut out because some of you may be aware there will be a number of North American-based companies with EU headquarters in Ireland, namely Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. So the Irish Supervisory Authority would be the regulatory authority here, or the Data Protection Commission would be the supervisory authority here in Ireland. Now, some of you may have come across the term one-stop shop system. And essentially what this is the GDPR has set up an all-encompassing one-stop shop system. And its purpose is to make it easier for data controllers and processors in a particular member state to just have to deal with the supervisory authority in that member state. So if, let's say, we take Amazon as an example, I understand that they have their European headquarters in Luxembourg. So if a data subject made a complaint, Amazon would only have to deal with the supervisory authority in Luxembourg, and that supervisory authority would be, and it is indeed obliged to cooperate with supervisory authorities elsewhere in the European Union. So that's what we mean by a one-stop shop system. And finally, overseeing how each of the supervisory authorities are making sure that GDPR is complied with is what's called the European Data Protection Board. In effect, the European Data Protection Board is the supervisory authority for the European member state supervisory authorities.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Thank you for that detailed answer. And it's very interesting, the one-stop shop. Considering Amazon, I'm sure, is in that part of the world for tax purposes that are going to be caught by another law there. So that's very interesting. Thank you, Neil. Moving into our next question. Does the GDPR only affect EU citizens? And what about EU citizens living abroad? I, in my own anecdotal conversations, feel like there's a lot of confusion around these two particular questions.
Yes, and I'm not surprised. There is a lot of confusion as to who does GDPR protect, and the simple answer to that is the GDPR regulation states that it applies to the personal data of data subjects who are in the European Union. So what that means is it's not just EU citizens who are in the European Union, it is also non-EU citizens who happen to be in the European Union. Now, what does in the European Union mean? Unfortunately, GDPR does not actually define that, but I personally believe that it would have to cover non-EU citizens who happen to be resident in the European Union. I don't believe, some may disagree with me, I don't believe that it would be expected to cover, let's say, somebody who happens to be visiting Europe as a tourist. So I think you'd have to be actually resident within the European Union. Now, the question about does GDPR protect, let's say, EU citizens that happen to be living abroad? And sometimes this question does indeed come up. The short answer is yes, GDPR does protect personal data of EU citizens living abroad, but only if their personal data is being processed by a company or a business which happens to have an establishment within the European Union. If the individual's personal data is not being processed by any company that does not have a presence within the European Union, I would hold that GDPR does not actually protect that citizen. So, for example, if you take an Irish national who emigrated to California 30 years ago, has been living there ever since, has his personal data processed by a company in California that has no presence in the European Union, GDPR will not protect that individual. That individual would have to rely on US data protection law. So yeah, it's unfortunately the GDPR regulation is a little bit not going to say unclear, but basically the rule is if you are in the European Union, your data is being processed, you are protected by GDPR.
So Neil, Robin here. I have a question on establishment, because I think that this seems to be a rather nebulous kind of a thing. For a lot of people, establishment is a physical presence, and I know in the US there was just a court case around taxation. It was Wayfair against North Dakota, and they ruled that physical presence was not the litmus test anymore for this particular tax case. It was no longer the litmus test for collection of sales taxes. The notion of establishment under GDPR, how is that defined?
Well, interestingly, GDPR, it does define main establishment. And what it says is it's the place of central administration within the European Union. And that kind of ties in somewhat with how the European Court of Justice has had to consider the meaning of establishment. Indeed, this problem has actually come up in trademark law, and it was only recently that the European Union had to really consider what establishment means. But simply put, it's wherever the sort of central administration of that company is within the European Union, because clearly you will have corporations that may have establishments in a number of EU states. And what GDPR says is that you have to look at where is the central administration carried out. So where is the main headquarters? Again, looking at, for example, LinkedIn, if it has subsidiaries, let's say in France and Germany, its central administration or its European headquarters is here in Ireland. So I hope that somewhat helps, but it is a concept, or that has been the subject of a number of judicial cases before the courts in the European Union.